I was still reaching for my church hat when my son grabbed it first and tossed it straight into the trash. "Mom, you can't keep wearing that thing," Daniel said, shaking his head like I was the embarrassment he'd been trying to hide. "It's outdated. People laugh." My fingers trembled, but I didn't argue. That hat had seen more truth than anyone in this house ever would. Then my phone rang. "Mrs. Brooke Emerson," a calm voice asked. "This is Bishop Harold Whitaker. I've been looking for you. You're the woman who saved my ministry." Daniel froze. And for the first time in years, so did I. "If this moment made you feel something, I'd really love to hear it. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there." I read every comment. And if you believe respect should never come with age alone, but with truth. If this moment made you feel something, I'd really love to hear it. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. And if you believe respect should never come with age alone, but with truth, consider liking and subscribing. It helps stories like mine reach people who might need them. After that phone call, the house felt different. Not warmer, not kinder, just quieter, like something had cracked open in the air, and no one quite knew how to seal it back up. Daniel stood in the kitchen long after I lowered my phone. His hand was still frozen halfway to the counter, his coffee untouched. Melissa, leaning against the island, crossed her arms tightly like she was bracing herself against something invisible. "Mom." Daniel finally said, his voice uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since he was a boy. What was that I didn't answer right away? Because the truth was, I didn't know where to begin. Instead, I walked past them slowly, my steps steady, even though my heart wasn't. I went straight to the sink and rinsed a clean plate that didn't need rinsing just to have something to do with my hands. "Just an old acquaintance," I said quietly. Melissa let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "An acquaintance? He called you the woman who saved his ministry. That doesn't sound like casual Sunday small talk." Her tone wasn't curious. It was sharp, defensive. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, Mom. You've never mentioned anything like that before." "Of course I hadn't. There are things you carry in your life that don't belong in casual conversations over dinner. Things that are safer tucked away in silence than exposed to people who might not understand, or worse, might not care." I dried my hands slowly and turned to face them. "It was a long time ago," I said. "It doesn't matter anymore." Daniel frowned. It clearly matters to him. I met his eyes, and for a moment I saw something flicker there. Confusion, maybe even a hint of doubt. Not about me, but about everything he thought he knew. But it passed just as quickly. He shook his head. "Look, Mom, if this is some kind of misunderstanding, it isn't," I said more firmly than I intended. The room went still again. Melissa pushed herself off the counter. "So you're saying you saved a church? That's what we're supposed to believe now?" I didn't respond, because I had spent years learning when silence said more than words ever could. She sighed dramatically and walked out of the kitchen, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like punctuation marks of disapproval. Daniel lingered a moment longer. "Mom, if there's something going on, you can just tell me." I looked at him. Really looked at him, at the man he had become. The same boy who used to sit beside me in church pews, swinging his legs, asking endless questions about everything he didn't understand. The same boy who once held my hand so tightly during thunderstorms that my fingers would go numb. Somewhere along the way, that boy had learned to look at me like I was less important, less relevant, less worthy of being heard. "I will," I said softly. "Just not today." He nodded, though I could tell he wasn't satisfied. Then he grabbed his keys and left the door shutting a little harder than necessary. And just like that, I was alone. Or at least as alone as you can feel in a house that was never really yours to begin with. I stood there for a long time after they were gone. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Outside, a car passed its tires hissing against the pavement. Normal sounds. A normal life. But none of it felt like mine. When I first moved into Daniel and Melissa's home 2 years ago, I told myself it was temporary. Just until things settled. Just until I figured out what came next after selling the house I had lived in for nearly 40 years. That house had been more than walls and a roof. It had been memories, laughter, quiet evenings with my husband before he passed. Every corner held a piece of a life I had built with care. But Daniel had insisted. "It's too much for you now, Mom," he'd said. "You shouldn't be alone." At the time, it had sounded like concern. Now, I understood it a little differently. Living here meant adapting. It meant shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that were already filled. It meant learning which cabinets you were allowed to use, which TV shows were acceptable to watch, which conversations you were welcome to join. It meant becoming invisible. I made my way slowly to the small room at the back of the house, my room. It used to be a guest bedroom, though Melissa had redecorated it before I moved in. Neutral tones, minimal decoration. Nothing that felt too personal. Nothing that felt like me. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then my eyes drifted to the empty hook by the closet. The place where my church hat should have been. A sharp ache settled in my chest. That hat wasn't just an accessory. It was a memory, a symbol, a reminder of a time when I had a purpose that extended beyond making myself small for the comfort of others. I crossed the room and reached out my fingers, brushing the empty space where it had hung. Gone. Thrown away like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter. I sat down on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap, staring at the floor. For a moment, I let myself feel it. The hurt, the humiliation, the quiet kind of grief that doesn't come from losing something, but from realizing how little it meant to someone else. But then, something shifted. Because beneath all of that pain, there was something else. Something steadier. Something stronger. Memory. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I wasn't in that small, quiet room anymore. I was somewhere else entirely. A different time. A different version of myself. One who wasn't afraid to speak up. One who knew exactly what that hat represented and why it had never truly been just a hat. My phone buzzed softly in my hand, pulling me back to the present. A message. Unknown number. I hesitated before opening it. Then I read the words slowly. "This is Bishop Whitaker. I would like to meet you in person. There are things you deserve to hear and things the church needs to say." I stared at the message for a long time, because part of me had always known this moment might come. I just never expected it to arrive like this. Not after all these years. Not after everything I had chosen to leave behind. I set the phone down gently on the nightstand and stood up. Then I walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon light stretched across the quiet street, warm and ordinary. A neighbor watered her lawn. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Life moving on, unaware. But inside me, something had already begun to shift. Because for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something. Not loss, not regret, but truth. And truth, I had learned long ago, has a way of finding its way back, no matter how deeply it's been buried. I glanced once more at the empty hook by the closet. Then I whispered softly, almost to myself, "I'm not done yet." Sunday mornings used to mean something. Now they just felt like a quiet reminder of everything that had changed. I woke up earlier than usual that day, long before the sun had fully risen. The house was still wrapped in that soft, fragile silence that only exists before the rest of the world begins to move. For a moment, I lay in bed and listened to the hum of the air conditioner, the faint creak of the pipes, the distant sound of a car passing somewhere far away. And then I remembered the empty hook, the missing hat. A heaviness settled in my chest before I even opened my eyes. For over 20 years, I had worn that hat to church every single Sunday. Rain or shine, good days and bad. It had become a part of me in a way I had never quite explained to anyone, not even to Daniel when he was young and still curious about everything. Back then, he used to ask me why I wore it. Because it reminds me who I am, I would tell him. He never really understood. But he used to smile anyway. Now I wasn't so sure he even remembered asking. I sat up slowly, pressing my feet against the cool wooden floor. My room felt smaller than usual, like the walls had inched closer overnight. Or maybe it was just me feeling smaller again. I dressed quietly, choosing a simple navy dress I had worn many times before. It wasn't anything special, but it was neat, respectful, appropriate. Still, when I looked at myself in the mirror, something felt unfinished. My eyes drifted almost instinctively to the closet, to the empty space where the hat should have been. For a moment, I considered not going to church at all. It would have been easy. No questions, no looks, no reminders of what I had lost. But something in me resisted that thought. Because if I stayed home, if I let one moment of disrespect take something away from me that had lasted decades, then what else would I be willing to give up? No. I straightened my shoulders. I picked up my purse. And I walked out of the room. Melissa was already in the kitchen when I stepped in. She was scrolling through her phone, a cup of coffee in her hand, her hair perfectly styled, as always. She glanced up briefly when she saw me, her eyes scanning me from head to toe, and then almost imperceptibly, she smirked. "No hat today?" she asked. Her tone was casual, but there was something underneath it, something sharp. I ignored it. "I'm leaving in a few minutes," I said instead. Daniel came down shortly after adjusting his watch as he walked into the kitchen. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much. His eyes flicked toward me, then quickly away. He noticed. Of course he did. The absence was louder than the presence had ever been. "You ready?" he asked, grabbing his keys from the counter. I nodded. The drive to St. Mark's Church was quiet. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The radio played softly in the background, some talk show neither of us was really listening to. I watched the familiar streets pass by, the same houses, the same trees, the same little details I had seen for years. Nothing had changed, except everything had. When we pulled into the church parking lot, my heart began to beat a little faster. St. Mark's looked exactly the same as it always had. The white-painted exterior, the tall steeple reaching toward the sky, the wide wooden doors that had welcomed generations of families, celebrations, and quiet prayers. For a moment, I just sat there, taking it in. Daniel turned off the engine and glanced at me. "You coming?" "Yes," I said softly. But I didn't move right away, because stepping out of that car meant stepping into a place that held more history for me than Daniel could ever imagine. Eventually, I opened the door and followed him out. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. A few people were already making their way inside, dressed in their Sunday best, exchanging polite smiles and greetings. As we walked toward the entrance, I could feel it. The looks, not judgmental exactly, but curious, noticing, because for years I had always been the woman with the hat, and now I wasn't. Inside the church was warm and softly lit. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews. The familiar scent of polished wood and old hymnals wrapped around me like a memory. I paused just inside the doorway, letting it all settle. This place had once been my world, my responsibility, my quiet purpose, and yet standing there now, I felt like a stranger. Brooke. I turned at the sound of my name. It was Mrs. Carter, the same neighbor who had witnessed everything the day before. She stood a few feet away, her expression kind, but searching. "I heard what happened," she said gently. I offered a small smile. "I'm all right." Her eyes drifted briefly to my head, then back to my face. "It's strange seeing you without it," she admitted. "Yes," I said. "It is." She hesitated, then lowered her voice slightly. "You know that hat always stood for something. People may not have understood it, but some of us noticed." Something in her words made my chest tighten. Noticed what I asked quietly. But before she could answer, someone called her name from across the room. "I'll talk to you later," she said quickly, giving my hand a gentle squeeze before walking away. I stood there for a moment, her words lingering in my mind. Some of us noticed what Daniel had already moved ahead, sliding into a pew near the middle of the church. I followed slowly, taking my place beside him. The service began like it always did. Hymns, prayers, familiar rhythms that should have felt comforting. But I couldn't focus, because every now and then, I felt it again. Those glances, those subtle looks from people who seemed to be searching for something that wasn't there. Or maybe something they were beginning to realize. Halfway through the service, the doors at the front of the church opened quietly. A man stepped inside. Tall, dressed in a dark suit, his presence immediately noticeable even from across the room. My breath caught in my throat, because I knew exactly who he was. Bishop Harold Whitaker. He hadn't changed much. Older, yes, a little more gray in his hair, but his posture, his presence, it was the same. Strong, steady, certain. And as he scanned the room, his eyes landed on me. For a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade. The voices, the music, the quiet shifting of people in their seats, all of it disappeared. Because the past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was here, standing right in front of me, and for the first time in 20 years, it was about to be seen. I couldn't breathe, not because anything had physically changed, but because everything inside me had. Bishop Harold Whitaker was walking down the aisle, not toward the pulpit, toward me. The shift in the room was immediate. Conversations softened, heads turned. Even the pastor paused mid-sentence, watching with a polite but puzzled smile as the bishop, someone who rarely made unexpected appearances, moved with quiet purpose through the church. Daniel stiffened beside me. "Mom, why is he coming over here?" he whispered. I didn't answer. Because I already knew. Or at least I feared I did. Each step he took seemed to echo louder than it should have, as if time itself had slowed just enough to force me to feel every second of it. And then he stopped. Right beside our pew. Up close, he looked older than I remembered. Lines etched deeper into his face. A certain weight in his eyes that hadn't been there 20 years ago. But there was something else, too. Recognition. "Mrs. Emerson?" he said gently. His voice carried just enough to draw the attention of the people sitting nearby. My hands tightened in my lap. "Bishop Whitaker?" I replied, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Daniel glanced between us, confusion turning quickly into something sharper. You two know each other?" he asked. The bishop turned his gaze to Daniel, offering a polite nod. "Yes," he said simply. "Your mother and I go back quite a long way." That wasn't an answer, and Daniel knew it. Before he could press further, the bishop looked back at me. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption," he said, "but I was hoping we might speak after the service." There it was, the moment I had been avoiding. I hesitated, because agreeing to that conversation meant opening a door I had kept closed for decades, but refusing. That would mean pretending none of it had ever mattered, and I couldn't do that. Not anymore. "Yes," I said quietly. "Of course." He smiled, warm, grateful. "Thank you," he said. "There are things that need to be set right." Set right. The words settled heavily in my chest. With one last nod, he turned and walked toward the front of the church, taking a seat near the first row. The service resumed, but it felt different now. Charged. Every word spoken from the pulpit seemed distant, like it was happening behind a thick pane of glass. My focus was elsewhere, on the man sitting just a few rows ahead, and on the past that was pressing closer with every passing minute. Daniel leaned in again. "Mom, what is going on?" he whispered, his voice tense. "It's not the time," I murmured. "Then when is?" he snapped under his breath. "Because this is weird. First the phone call, now this, Daniel," I said softly but firmly. He stopped, not because he understood, but because he wasn't used to me interrupting him. We sat in silence after that, but I could feel his questions building, stacking one on top of the other, waiting for the moment they would spill out. When the final hymn ended and people began to stand, the room filled with movement and conversation once again. But this time, it was different. Because now people were looking at me, not casually, not politely, but with curiosity, with recognition, and in some cases, with something that looked almost like respect. It unsettled me, because I hadn't earned that not here, not in their eyes, not yet. "Mrs. Emerson." I turned to see one of the church elders approaching. Mr. Holloway, if I remembered correctly. He had always been kind, though we had never spoken much. "I hope you don't mind," he said, glancing briefly toward the bishop, "but we've been hoping to meet you for some time." My breath caught slightly. "For some time," I repeated. He nodded. "Yes, there have been discussions, questions, things that have come to light recently." Before I could respond, Daniel stepped forward. "Okay, I think we're missing something here," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "My mom hasn't even been involved with the church like that in years, so whatever you think you know." "Daniel," I said quietly. He stopped, but his jaw remained clenched. Mr. Holloway looked at him calmly. "Sometimes, son, the most important contributions are the ones no one sees at the time." Daniel didn't like that answer. I could tell. But before he could argue, Bishop Whitaker approached us again. "Shall we?" he said, gesturing toward a side hallway that led to the administrative offices. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "He'll come with you," Daniel said quickly. The bishop paused, then looked at me. "This conversation is delicate," he said carefully. "It concerns my mother," Daniel insisted. "I have a right to be there." I met the bishop's eyes, and then I nodded. "It's all right," I said. "He can come. If this truth was going to come out, it might as well come out completely." Melissa joined us, then her expression tight with unease. "I'm not staying out here if something serious is happening," she said. So the four of us walked down that quiet hallway together. Each step felt heavier than the last. The office we entered was small but formal. A wooden desk, a few chairs, shelves lined with old records and books that smelled faintly of dust and time. The bishop closed the door behind us. And just like that, the outside world disappeared. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he stood across from me, studying my face with a kind of quiet intensity. "I've thought about this moment for many years," he said. I swallowed. "So have I admitted." Daniel looked between us, his patience clearly running thin. "Can someone please explain what's going on?" he demanded. The bishop finally turned to him. "Your mother," he said slowly, "did something extraordinary 20 years ago." Daniel let out a short, incredulous laugh. "With all due respect, I think you might have the wrong person." "I don't," the bishop said firmly. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Unavoidable. Then he stepped closer to the desk and opened a folder that had been resting there. Inside were documents, old, slightly yellowed at the edges. He carefully lifted one and placed it on the desk, turning it so we could see. This, he said, was the beginning. I stepped forward slowly. My eyes scanned the page, and just like that, I was pulled back. Back to a time I had tried so hard to leave behind. "This is a financial report," Daniel said, frowning. "Yes," the bishop replied, one that revealed discrepancies, missing funds, patterns that didn't make sense. Melissa crossed her arms. "So that happens." "Accounting errors." "These weren't errors," the bishop interrupted gently. He looked at me again. "They were discovered by your mother." The room went completely still. Daniel blinked. "Once? Twice?" "No," he said quietly. "That's not possible." But I didn't deny it, because the truth had already begun to speak for itself. "No," Daniel repeated, this time louder. "That's not possible." His voice echoed slightly against the walls of the office, sharp with disbelief. He looked at me as if waiting, no expecting for me to correct the bishop, to laugh it off, to say there had been some mistake. But I didn't, because there wasn't. I stepped closer to the desk, my fingers hovering over the documents Bishop Whitaker had laid out. The paper felt fragile under my touch, as though it might crumble if I pressed too hard. But the memories didn't. They came back all at once, clear, unforgiving. "This was from the audit in 2003. The bishop continued, his voice steady, respectful. "At the time, the discrepancies were small enough to be dismissed. Clerical errors, miscalculations. But your mother, she noticed a pattern." Melissa frowned. "A pattern of what? Missing money?" I said quietly. The words felt heavier now than they had back then, because back then, I had been alone with them. Daniel shook his head, almost laughing again, but there was no humor in it this time. "Mom, you worked as a secretary," he said. "You filed papers. You answered phones. You didn't." He stopped himself, but the implication had already landed. "You didn't matter enough to find something like that." I met his gaze. "I also paid attention," I said. The room fell silent again. Bishop Whitaker gave a small nod, as if affirming something long overdue. "She brought the records to me personally," he said. "Late one evening. I still remember it." She was nervous, but certain. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I could see it so clearly. The dim light in the office, The stacks of files I had gone through again and again, double-checking every number, every signature, every date. Hoping, praying that I had made a mistake. But I hadn't. I thought it would be simple. I said, my voice softer now. That we would look into it, fix it quietly, and move on. But it wasn't simple, the bishop said. No, I whispered. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. Okay, so there was missing money. That doesn't explain why this is such a big deal now. The bishop turned toward her. Because the person responsible, he said, was someone in a position of great authority. I didn't need him to say the name. I already knew, but hearing it out loud still felt like reopening an old wound. Pastor Leonard Briggs, he said. Daniel's expression changed. Recognition. Wait, Briggs, I've heard that name before. Didn't he? Leave suddenly, the bishop finished. Yes. People said it was health issues, Melissa added. The bishop's lips pressed into a thin line. That's what we allowed people to believe, he said. I exhaled slowly, because that had been the agreement, the compromise, the truth buried just deep enough to protect the church without destroying it completely. But it wasn't the truth, Daniel said. No, the bishop replied, it wasn't. Silence stretched between us again, heavy, uncomfortable. And you're saying my mother what Daniel asked? She exposed him? No, I said. They all looked at me. I didn't expose anyone, I continued, not directly. Melissa crossed her arms again. Then what did you do? I hesitated, because this was the part I had never told anyone. The part that had stayed hidden even after everything else had faded. I documented everything I said finally, every discrepancy, every transaction that didn't make sense. I copied records. I kept notes. Daniel blinked. You kept evidence? Yes. Why didn't you just report it? He asked. I tried. I said, at first. My voice wavered slightly, but I pushed through. I brought it to Bishop Whitaker, and he believed me. But we didn't have enough proof yet. Not enough to take it to the board without risking everything. The bishop nodded. If we had accused Pastor Briggs without solid evidence, it could have destroyed the church, split the congregation, ruined lives. Melissa let out a quiet scoff. So instead you just waited? No. I said, my voice firmer now. I kept watching. The room seemed to lean in around me, listening, because now there was no turning back. I stayed late. I went through records no one else bothered to check. I started seeing patterns, accounts that were being used in ways they shouldn't have been. Donations that never made it to where they were supposed to go. And you figured all that out by yourself? Daniel asked, disbelief still clinging to his words. Yes. He shook his head slowly, like he was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of me. The one he thought he knew, and the one standing in front of him now. But figuring it out wasn't the hardest part. I said quietly. It was what came next. Melissa tilted her head. What do you mean I looked down at the document in front of me? At the numbers that had once terrified me? At some point, I said someone realized I knew. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Daniel's voice softened. What happened? I swallowed. I started getting messages, I said. Notes left on my desk. Calls where no one spoke. Just silence and then a click. Melissa's eyes widened slightly. You're saying someone was threatening you? Yes. The word hung in the air. Simple. Terrifying. I tried to ignore it at first, I continued. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overreacting. But you weren't the bishop? Said gently. No, I said. I looked up at Daniel. They knew I had something, I said. and they wanted me to stop. His face had gone pale. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, almost whispering. "You were a teenager," I said. "What was I supposed to say? That your mother might be in danger because she couldn't ignore the truth?" He didn't answer, because there wasn't one. "So, what did you do?" Melissa asked, her voice quieter now. I took a slow breath, and then I said the words that had lived inside me for 20 years. "I hid the evidence." The bishop stepped forward slightly. "She sewed it into the lining of her church hat," he said. Daniel's head snapped toward me. "The hat," he said. "Yes." I nodded slowly. "The one you threw away yesterday." Silence. Absolute silence. Because now everything had changed. "The hat," Daniel repeated, his voice hollow, like the meaning hadn't quite reached him yet. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "The same hat." Melissa let out a sharp breath. "You're telling me all of this? This entire situation has been sitting inside that old thing his whole time?" "Not all of it," I said quietly. "But enough." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing a step away from the desk. His movements were restless now, unsettled. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Why not just his whole time?" "Not all of it," I said quietly. "But enough." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing a step away from the desk. His movements were restless now, unsettled. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Why not just give it to someone?" "The police?" "The church board." "Because I didn't know who I could trust," I said. That was the truth. The hardest part of all of it. When you realize something like that is happening, I continued, you start to question everything, every person, every conversation, even the ones you thought were safe. The bishop nodded slowly. "She came to me because she believed I was outside of it," he said, "and I was, but we still didn't know how far it went, whether Pastor Briggs was acting alone, or if others were involved." Melissa's expression shifted, her earlier skepticism fading into something more uneasy. "So she hid the evidence," she said, almost to herself. "Yes," the bishop replied. "And she protected it better than anyone else could have at the time." Daniel stopped pacing. He looked at me again, really looked this time. Not as his mother. Not as the woman who quietly lived in his house, but as someone he didn't fully recognize. "You were scared," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I answered. "Then why didn't you stop?" he pressed. "Why keep going if you thought you were in danger?" I hesitated. Because the answer wasn't simple. It never had been. "Because someone had to," I said, finally. The room fell quiet again. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it. I continued. I couldn't go back to filing papers and answering phones like everything was fine. Not when I knew what was happening behind the scenes. I turned slightly, my gaze drifting to the window for a moment. I kept thinking about the people who trusted the church, I said. The families who gave what little they had. The ones who believed they were helping something good. I kept thinking about the people who trusted the church, I said. The families who gave what little they had. The ones who believed they were helping something good. I swallowed. They deserved better. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly, not in defeat, but in understanding. Slow, incomplete, but real. "And the threats?" Melissa asked carefully. "They just stopped." I shook my head. "No," I said. "They didn't." The bishop stepped forward again. "This is the part," he said gently, "that very few people know." I looked at him, then back at Daniel. Because now there was no more holding back. "They escalated," I said. Daniel's face tightened. "What do you mean?" They stopped being subtle, I said. My hands clasped together in front of me, fingers tightening as the memories sharpened. There was one night, I continued, when I stayed late again. Later than usual. I was going through records, cross-checking something I thought I had missed. I could see it clearly now. The empty office, the dim lights, the quiet that didn't feel peaceful anymore. And when I finally left, my car wouldn't start. Daniel frowned. That could have been anything. No, I said, shaking my head. It wasn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. The next morning, I said there was a note on my desk. Melissa leaned forward slightly. What did it say? I met her eyes. It said, "Stop digging, or you won't make it home next time." Daniel's breath caught. You're serious? He asked. I've never been more serious in my life, I said. The weight of it settled over the room like a storm cloud. Why didn't you go to the police? He asked again. His voice strained now. Because I didn't have enough, I said. Not yet. And if I had gone too soon, if I had tipped them off, the evidence could have disappeared before anyone had the chance to see it. The bishop nodded. She was right, he said. It was a delicate situation. One wrong move and everything could have been lost. Melissa shook her head slowly. So you just kept going knowing someone might actually hurt you? Yes, I said. There was no other answer, and eventually I continued. I had enough. I looked down at the documents on the desk. At least, I thought I did. Daniel stepped closer again. So, what happened? And eventually, I continued. I had enough. I looked down at the documents on the desk. At least, I thought I did. Daniel stepped closer again. So what happened? He asked. You said you didn't expose him directly, so how did it end? I exhaled slowly. Because I realized something I said, what he asked, that if I went public, if I stood up and accused Pastor Briggs myself, it would turn into something bigger than the truth. Melissa frowned. What do you mean? I mean, people would take sides, I said. They would argue, deny, defend him, attack me. And in the middle of all that, the truth might get buried under everything else. The bishop's expression softened. She understood something most people don't, he said. That sometimes the truth needs to be delivered in a way that people are willing to accept. I nodded. So I made a decision, I said. Daniel leaned in slightly. What decision? I met his eyes. I disappeared from the story. Confusion flickered across his face. I don't understand, he said. I sent the evidence anonymously, I explained. Every document, every record, every detail I had collected. Melissa's eyes widened. To who? The church's National Oversight Committee, I said. The people above everyone else. The ones who couldn't ignore it. The bishop nodded again. They opened an investigation almost immediately, he said. And because the evidence was so thorough, so precise, they couldn't dismiss it. Daniel's voice dropped. And Pastor Briggs was forced to resign. They opened an investigation almost immediately, he said. And because the evidence was so thorough, so precise, they couldn't dismiss it. Daniel's voice dropped. And Pastor Briggs was forced to resign, the bishop said, quietly, without a public scandal, but permanently removed. Silence filled the room once more. But this time, it felt different, heavier, but clearer. And no one knew it was you, Daniel said. No, I replied. Why not? He asked. I gave a small, tired smile. Because I didn't need them to, I said. Melissa shook her head slowly. You risked your safety, your life, and you didn't even take credit. I looked at her. At the time, I said it wasn't about credit. It was about doing what was right. Even if no one ever knew. Even if no one ever said thank you, even if years later your own son would throw the very thing that protected that truth into the trash. Daniel flinched slightly at that. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to, because now he understood, at least a part of it. And for the first time since we walked into that room, he didn't look at me like I was small. He looked at me like he didn't know where I ended and where the truth began. "The hat," Daniel said again, but this time it wasn't disbelief in his voice. It was something else, something heavier, something closer to guilt. "You're saying?" When I threw it away. He stopped swallowing hard. "I could have lost everything," Melissa finished quietly. I didn't answer right away, because I had already asked myself that question the night before standing over that trash bin, my hands trembling as I searched through things no one should have to search through. Rotting food, broken packaging, things discarded without thought. And somewhere in there, the truth that had once protected an entire institution. "Yes," I said finally. Daniel let out a slow breath, stepping back like the weight of it had physically pushed him. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied, and I meant it, because ignorance and cruelty, they don't always come from the same place, but they can hurt just the same. The bishop moved closer to the desk again, his hand resting gently on the edge as he looked at Daniel. "Your mother didn't just protect evidence," he said. "She protected the integrity of this church at a time when it could have collapsed under scandal." Daniel shook his head slowly. "But no one ever knew, not even us." "That was her choice," the bishop said. Melissa frowned slightly. "But why keep it a secret all these years?" Even after everything was resolved, I looked at her, because that question that one had followed me for a long time. "Because it wasn't safe," I said. Her brows furrowed. "After 20 years? Yes." Daniel looked confused again. "I thought you said Pastor Briggs was removed, that the situation was handled." "It was," I said. "But that doesn't mean every consequence disappeared." The bishop nodded, his expression growing more serious. "There were connections," he said carefully. "Financial ties that extended beyond the church itself. Individuals who benefited from those transactions in ways that were never fully uncovered." Melissa's arms tightened around herself again. "You're saying there were other people involved. We were never able to prove it conclusively," the bishop replied. "But we had reason to believe Pastor Briggs wasn't acting entirely alone." The room fell silent once more. Daniel looked at me, his voice softer now. "And they knew you were the one who found it." "Yes," I said. "Then why didn't they come after you again?" he asked. I gave a small, almost tired smile. "Because I disappeared," I said. He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I stopped being part of that world," I explained. I left my position shortly after the investigation concluded. I stepped away from anything that could connect me back to it. Melissa tilted her head. "You just walked away." "Yes, after everything you did." "Yes." She shook her head slightly like she couldn't quite understand it. "Why?" she asked. I looked down at my hands. "Because I didn't want that to define the rest of my life," I said, "and because sometimes the safest place to be is where no one is looking for you." Daniel absorbed that in silence. "But then why keep the evidence?" he asked. "If everything was already done, why not destroy it?" That question lingered, because it was one I had asked myself more than once over the years. I thought about it, I admitted, more times than I can count. "But you didn't," Melissa said. "No." "Why not?" I looked up. Because something in me kept saying, what if it wasn't really over? The bishop exhaled slowly. And it wasn't, he said. All eyes turned to him. What do you mean? Daniel asked. The bishop reached into the folder again and pulled out another document, this one newer, the paper crisp, the ink darker. This, he said, placing it on the desk, is from a recent audit. Melissa leaned forward slightly. Another one? Yes. Daniel's voice sharpened, and the bishop hesitated for just a moment. As part of our routine financial review, he said we uncovered irregularities, smaller than before but similar in nature. A chill ran through me. No, not again. That's not possible, I said, shaking my head. We stopped it. We made sure. I know, the bishop said gently, and for many years everything was clean, transparent, accountable. Then what changed? Melissa asked. That's what we're trying to determine, he replied. Daniel looked between us, his confusion turning into concern. Wait, are you saying this is happening again? That someone is stealing from the church? We don't know yet, the bishop said carefully. But the patterns, they resemble what your mother discovered all those years ago. The room seemed to tilt slightly, because suddenly this wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about now. This is why you called me, I said, slowly. Yes, he replied. Because you think, I think he interrupted gently that the person who saw it first might be the one who can see it again. Daniel shook his head. No, that's not fair. You can't just drag her back into something like that. I'm not asking her to do anything, the bishop said. I'm asking for her insight. Melissa crossed her arms again, but this time there was no mockery in her posture, only tension. And if she refuses, she asked. The bishop looked at me. Then we respect that, he said. Silence fell once more. But this silence was different. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about a choice, a dangerous one. Because stepping back into that world, silence fell once more. But this silence was different. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about a choice, a dangerous one. Because stepping back into that world, even in the smallest way, meant risking everything I had spent years trying to leave behind. Daniel turned to me, his expression conflicted. You don't have to do this, he said. You've already done enough. I met his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something there I hadn't seen in years. Not frustration, not dismissal, but concern. Real concern. I know, I said. Melissa looked at me too, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. But if what he's saying is true, she began, then hesitated. If it's happening again, not frustration, not dismissal, but concern. Real concern. I know, I said. Melissa looked at me too, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. But if what he's saying is true, she began, then hesitated. If it's happening again, someone could get hurt. The words hung in the air. Because we all knew that wasn't just a possibility, it was a memory, one that had never fully faded. I took a slow breath, because deep down, I already knew the truth. The same truth that had guided me 20 years ago. The same truth that had kept me awake at night going over numbers that didn't add up. The same truth that had made me risk everything without ever asking for recognition. I looked at the bishop, then at Daniel, then at Melissa, and finally back at the documents on the desk. The past wasn't finished with me. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't finished with it either. "It'll help," I said quietly. The words settled into the room like a turning point. Because once they were spoken, there was no going back. The drive home felt longer than usual. No one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. Daniel kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed ahead, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed every few seconds, like he was holding something back. Melissa sat beside him quieter than I had ever seen her. No comments, no sighs, just silence. And me. I sat in the back seat, staring out the window, watching the world pass by as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because, for the first time in years, the truth wasn't just mine anymore. They knew. Not all of it, but enough. When we pulled into the driveway, no one moved right away. The engine went silent. The air inside the car felt thick. Daniel finally exhaled and turned off the ignition completely. "Mom," he started, then stopped. I waited because I could hear it in his voice. This wasn't going to be easy for him. He rubbed his face with one hand. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied softly, but he shook his head. "No, I do." He turned slightly in his seat to face me. "I threw it away," he said. "The hat. I didn't just disrespect you. I could have destroyed something that mattered, something important." I held his gaze. "You didn't know?" I said again. "But I should have," he insisted. Melissa glanced back at me, then her expression different now. Less guarded. "I didn't stop him," she said quietly. "I actually agreed with him. I thought—" She hesitated, then admitted, "I thought it was just an old habit you couldn't let go of." I nodded. "Most people did," I said. The truth of that didn't sting anymore. Not the way it used to. Daniel let out a frustrated breath and stepped out of the car, pacing a few steps across the driveway before turning back. "So what do we do now?" he asked. "If that evidence is gone, if it's sitting in some landfill somewhere, how are you supposed to help them?" That question hung in the air, because it was the one I had been asking myself since the moment I realized the hat was missing. I stepped out of the car, slowly closing the door behind me. The hat wasn't the only thing I said. Both of them froze. "What do you mean?" Melissa asked. I walked toward the front door, my steps calm, deliberate. Because this part had always been mine alone. I learned a long time ago, I said, unlocking the door, that you never keep all your truth in one place. Daniel frowned, following me inside. "So you made copies?" he asked. "Yes." Melissa's eyes widened slightly. "Of everything. Of what mattered," I replied. We stepped into the living room, the familiar space feeling strangely different now. Like the walls themselves were listening. I walked past the couch, past the neatly arranged shelves, and toward a small cabinet tucked against the far wall. Melissa watched me closely. "I've seen you open that drawer 100 times, she said. "You keep old photos in there." "Yes," I said. "And something else." I knelt down slowly and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were photo albums neatly stacked, each one labeled by year. Family moments, holidays, birthdays. The life they thought they knew. I carefully lifted the top album and set it aside. Then the next, and the next, until I reached the bottom. There, hidden beneath everything else, was a thin, sealed envelope. Daniel's breath caught slightly. "You've had that here the whole time?" he asked. "Yes." "Why here?" Melissa asked. I looked up at her. Because no one ever thinks to look inside something they believe they already understand. I said. Carefully, I picked up the envelope and stood. The weight of it felt familiar in my hands. Not heavy in size, but heavy in meaning. This, I said, holding it out slightly, is everything I kept after the investigation ended. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes fixed on it. Does it prove what happened back then? He asked. Yes. And it can help with what's happening now. I hesitated. Maybe, I said. Or maybe it will show us something we didn't see before. Melissa crossed her arms, but not defensively this time. More like she was grounding herself. Then why didn't you tell them you still had this? She asked. Because I needed to be sure, I said. Of what? That it was necessary. The room went quiet again. Because now it was. I looked down at the envelope for a moment, then back at them. I didn't want to be pulled back into something like this unless I had no other choice, I said. Daniel nodded slowly. And now you don't. No, I said. I don't. He took a deep breath, then asked the question that had been building since we left the church. So, what happens next? I walked over to the table and set the envelope down carefully. What happens next, I said, is that we stop assuming this is just history repeating itself. Melissa frowned. What do you mean? I met her eyes. I mean, if the patterns are similar but smaller, more controlled, then whoever is doing this now learned fro. Whoever is doing this now learned from him. What happened before? Daniel's expression tightened. You think someone studied the old case? He asked. Yes, I said. Or I paused. Or they were closer to it than we realized. What happened before? Daniel's expression tightened. You think someone studied the old case? He asked. Yes, I said. Or I paused. Or they were closer to it than we realized. The implication settled heavily between us. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about corruption. It was about someone who understood the system, someone who knew how to stay hidden, someone who had been there or had been watching. Melissa's voice dropped slightly. You think it could be someone from the church? I think it has to be, I said. Daniel shook his head. But the bishop said they cleaned everything up, that everything was transparent after that. They believed it was, I replied. But belief doesn't always mean truth. Silence. Then Daniel asked quietly, So, what are you going to do? I looked at the envelope, then at the two of them, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone in the weight of it. I'm going to meet with the bishop again, I said. And this time, I'm not just going to tell him what I remember. I placed my hand gently on the envelope. I'm going to show him. Melissa nodded slowly. Daniel didn't say anything at first, but then he stepped closer. Mom, he said. I looked at him. I'm coming with you. I studied his face. The hesitation, the guilt, the determination. Are you sure? I asked. He nodded. I should have been there the first time, he said, even if I didn't know it. Something in my chest softened, because for the first time, he wasn't just standing beside me. He was choosing to stand with me. All right, I said quietly. And just like that, this wasn't my story alone anymore. It was ours, and whatever truth waited ahead, we were going to face it together. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had awakened again, something I had buried for years under routine silence and the quiet comfort of being overlooked. I sat at the kitchen table long after Daniel and Melissa had gone to bed, the envelope resting in front of me like a question I had already answered. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second louder than the last. I hadn't opened the envelope in years, not once, because I had promised myself I wouldn't unless I had to. And now I had to. My fingers hovered over the seal for a long moment before I finally broke it. The sound was soft, but it felt like something much bigger, like the past cracking open. Inside were the documents I remembered, carefully folded, preserved, protected. I spread them out across the table one by one. Old financial records, handwritten notes, copies of ledgers I had once memorized line by line, and there tucked between 2 pages, something I didn't expect, a photograph. I froze because I didn't remember putting it there. Slowly, I picked it up. It was taken inside the church office. I recognized the desk, the filing cabinets, even the angle of the light coming through the window. But it wasn't the room that made my breath catch. It was the people. Pastor Leonard Briggs stood near the desk, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. And beside him, someone else, partially turned away from the camera. Face not fully visible, but familiar. Too familiar. My chest tightened. No, that wasn't possible. I leaned closer, studying the image more carefully. The shape of the shoulders, the way the man held his posture, confident, relaxed, like he belonged there. And then I saw it. The ring, a distinctive silver band with a small engraving on the side. I had seen that ring before, many times. Recently, a cold realization began to spread through me, because this wasn't just someone who had been around 20 years ago. This was someone who was still here, still part of the church, still trusted. The front door creaked open behind me. I turned sharply, creaked open behind me. I turned sharply, my heart jumping into my throat. Daniel stepped inside, his expression tired but alert. I thought I heard something he said. Then his eyes landed on the table. "You're still up?" "Yes," my heart jumping into my throat. Daniel stepped inside, his expression tired but alert. I thought I heard something he said. Then his eyes landed on the table. "You're still up?" "Yes," I said quietly. He walked over slowly, his gaze moving across the documents. "So this is it," he murmured. "Everything you kept." "Most of it," I said. He nodded, then noticed the photograph in my hand. "What's that?" I hesitated, because once I showed him, there was no taking it back. But we were already past that point. I handed it to him. He studied it for a few seconds. Then his brow furrowed. "That's Pastor Briggs," he said. "I've seen old photos of him before." "Yes," I replied. "And someone else." He tilted the picture slightly. "I can't really see his face. You don't need to," I said. Daniel glanced up at me. "What do you mean?" I took a slow breath. "Look at his hand," I said. He frowned, then looked again. At first, there was nothing. Then, his expression changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. "Wait," he said slowly. His eyes moved back and forth between the photograph and his own memory. "I've seen that ring," he whispered. "Yes," I said. Silence. Then, "No," he said, suddenly shaking his head. "No, that doesn't make sense." "It does," I replied. "It can't," he insisted. You're saying that someone from back then is still involved now, that they were working with Briggs? I'm saying we don't know yet, I said carefully. But we need to find out. Daniel stared at the photograph again, his grip tightening slightly. Who is it? He asked. I met his eyes, and for a moment I almost said the name, but I stopped myself. Because suspicion wasn't proof. Not yet. Someone we both know, I said instead. That answer didn't satisfy him. I could see it. But it was enough for now. Melissa appeared in the doorway, then her robe loosely wrapped around her. What's going on? She asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. Daniel turned toward her, holding up the photograph. We might have a problem, he said. She stepped closer, peering at it. And that is, I watched her carefully. Because if I was right, if what I was starting to see was true, then this wasn't just a problem. It was something much bigger. Look at the ring, Daniel said. Melissa squinted slightly. Then her eyes widened. Oh my God, she whispered. She looked up at me, her face pale. You don't think it was something much bigger? Look at the ring, Daniel said. Melissa squinted slightly. Then her eyes widened. Oh my God, she whispered. She looked up at me, her face pale. You don't think I don't think anything yet, I said. But I'm not ignoring it either. The room felt colder now. Not physically, but in a way that settled deep under the skin. Because the danger wasn't in the past anymore. It was here, inside the present, inside the same walls we thought were safe. Daniel placed the photograph back on the table slowly. So, what do we do? He asked. I looked down at the documents, at the evidence, at the truth that had waited patiently for 20 years. We go to the bishop, I said. Melissa nodded immediately. And we show him everything. Yes. Daniel hesitated. And what about him? He asked quietly. I understood the question, the fear behind it, because naming someone meant confronting them, and confronting them meant risking everything again. We don't accuse anyone, I said. Not yet. Melissa crossed her arms, but there was no defiance in it. Only tension. But if you're right, she said slowly, then whoever this is, and confronting them meant risking everything again. We don't accuse anyone, I said. Not yet. Melissa crossed her arms, but there was no defiance in it. Only tension. But if you're right, she said slowly, then whoever this is, they already know how to stay hidden. Yes, I said, and they won't go down easily. No, I agreed. Daniel let out a slow breath. Then we need to be careful, he said. I nodded. More careful than we were before. Because this time, we weren't dealing with someone who made mistakes. We were dealing with someone who learned from them. And that made them far more dangerous. I gathered the documents carefully, sliding them back into the envelope, except for the photograph. That I kept in my hand, because something about it felt different, like it wasn't just a clue, but a warning. And as I stood there looking at the faces frozen in that moment from 20 years ago, I realized something that made my stomach turn. This wasn't just a story repeating itself. This was a story that had never truly ended. And now, it was ready to be told. The next morning felt unreal. Not because anything dramatic had happened overnight, but because everything inside me had shifted. I woke up before the sun, already dressed by the time Daniel came downstairs. He paused at the bottom step, clearly surprised. You didn't sleep, did you? He asked. Enough, I replied. It wasn't true. But I didn't need sleep. Not today. Today, I needed clarity. Melissa joined us a few minutes later, quieter than usual, her eyes flicking toward the envelope sitting on the kitchen table like it might move on its own. Are we really doing this? She asked. Yes, I said. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Because once you recognize the truth, ignoring it becomes impossible. Daniel picked up his keys. Then, let's go. The drive to the church felt different this time. Heavier, more focused. The building looked the same as it always had. White walls, tall windows, the cross standing steady against the sky. But now, I saw it differently. Not just as a place of faith, but as a place that had held secrets, and maybe still did. Bishop Whitaker was waiting for us. Not in the main sanctuary this time, but in a small conference room tucked behind the administrative offices. He stood when we entered, his expression serious but calm. I'm glad you came, he said. I nodded, setting the envelope carefully on the table. We need to talk. He glanced at Daniel and Melissa briefly, then back at me. I assume this is more than just a memory, he said. Yes, I replied, and it might change everything you think you know about what's happening now. That got his attention. He closed the door behind us. Then please, he said, gesturing toward the table. Show me. I took a seat, slowly opening the envelope with steady hands. The documents slid out easily, spreading across the surface like pieces of a story that had waited too long to be told. Daniel stood beside me. Melissa remained near the door, arms crossed, watching everything closely. I handed the photograph to the bishop first. He studied it in silence. His expression didn't change at first, but then it did, subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a pause that lasted just a second too long. You recognize him, I said. It wasn't a question. The bishop exhaled slowly. Yes, he said. Daniel stepped forward immediately. Who is it? He asked. The bishop didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the photograph down carefully on the table. This is complicated, he said. No, I replied firmly. It's not. He looked at me, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between us. Because we both understood what was at stake. You called me here because something didn't feel right, I continued. Because the patterns were familiar. Because something reminded you of what happened 20 years ago. He nodded slowly. Yes. Then don't hold back now, I said. The room went completely still. Daniel's patience snapped. Who is it? He demanded. The bishop finally looked at him, then back at the photograph. And then he said the name, Ethan Caldwell. The air seemed to leave the room all at once. Melissa's hand dropped from her arm. Daniel stared at the bishop like he had just spoken a different language. That's not possible, he said. But this time, his voice didn't carry certainty, only fear. Because we all knew who Ethan Caldwell was, the church treasurer. A man trusted with every dollar that passed through the building. A man who had shaken Daniel's hand just days ago. A man who had smiled at me during service, as if he didn't recognize me, or worse, as if he did. You're sure? Melissa asked quietly. The bishop nodded. I've seen that ring, he said. He's worn it for years. It was passed down from his father. My stomach dropped. Because that meant he's connected to it, I said. To Briggs. Yes, the bishop replied. Daniel ran a hand through his hair again, pacing the room. No rough, his hair again pacing the room. No, 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 no. This doesn't make sense. Ethan's been here for over a decade. If he was involved before, why wait this long to start again? Maybe he didn't, I said. They all looked at me. What do you mean? Daniel asked. I leaned forward slightly, pointing to the documents. These patterns, they're smaller, more careful, more controlled. The bishop nodded slowly. Yes, that means he learned, I said. Learned from what happened the first time. Melissa frowned. So he's been doing this slowly, quietly. Yes, I said, building something we didn't notice. Daniel stopped pacing, and the audit just now caught the beginning of it, he said. Or what he wanted us to see, I replied. Silence, because that possibility was worse. Much worse. The bishop sat down slowly. If this is true, he said, then we're dealing with someone who understands the system intimately. Someone who knows how to stay just under the threshold of suspicion. And someone who already got away with it once, Melissa added. I nodded. Yes. Daniel turned toward me, his voice tight. So what do we do? Go to the police. Confront him. No, I said immediately. All three of them looked at me. No, Daniel repeated. Not yet, I said. Why not? He asked. Because we don't have enough, I replied. The bishop frowned. We have this photograph. We have the old records. We have the new discrepancies, and none of it proves he's doing it. Now, I said. The truth landed hard, because it was frustrating, but it was real. If we accuse him without solid proof, I continued, he'll deny everything, and this time, he'll know exactly what to hide. Melissa nodded slowly. She's right. Daniel let out a frustrated breath. So we just wait. No, I said. We watch. The bishop leaned forward slightly. What are you suggesting? I looked at the documents again, at the patterns I had once memorized, at the mistakes that had led me here. We tracked the numbers, I said, carefully, quietly, the same way I did before. Daniel shook his head. That's dangerous. Yes, I said. It is, but it's the only way to be sure. The bishop studied me for a long moment. You're asking to do this again? He said. I'm offering, I corrected. Melissa looked between us. And this time, we don't let her do it alone. I glanced at her surprised, but she didn't look away. I may not understand everything that happened before, she said, but I understand enough to know this matters. Daniel nodded slowly. I'm in too. The room shifted, because now this wasn't just about the past. This was a team, a choice, a risk shared between all of us. The bishop exhaled deeply. If we do this, he said, we do it carefully, quietly. No one else can know. I nodded. Agreed. He looked at me one more time. Are you sure you want to go through this again? I didn't hesitate, because I already knew the answer. I never wanted to, I said, but I'm not the kind of person who looks away. And as those words settled into the room, I realized something. 20 years ago, I had been alone. This time, I wasn't. And that might be the difference between truth being buried and truth finally being seen. The first time you decide to watch someone truly watch them, everything changes, because you stop seeing what they show you and start noticing what they hide. The following Sunday, I sat in the third row like I always had. Same seat, same view of the altar. Same familiar hymns echoing softly through the sanctuary. But nothing felt the same. Because now, I wasn't just there to worship. I was there to observe. Ethan Caldwell stood near the front, speaking quietly with one of the deacons before the service began. He looked exactly as he always had, calm, composed, confident, respectable, trustworthy. That was the word people used for him, trustworthy. And maybe that was what made him dangerous. Daniel sat beside me unusually still. Melissa was on my other side, her posture stiff, her eyes following Ethan with a focus I had never seen from her before. "Is that him?" she whispered. "Yes," I replied softly. Daniel leaned slightly forward. "He doesn't look like someone hiding anything," he murmured. I gave a small, almost sad smile. They never do. The service began. Songs, prayers, scripture, everything moving in its familiar rhythm. But my attention wasn't on the sermon. It was on the small things, the way Ethan checked his watch twice during the offering, the way he glanced not at the congregation, but at the donation counters as they were passed down the rows, the way his smile tightened just slightly when one of the ushers took longer than expected to return. Small details, easy to miss, unless you were looking for them. After the service ended, people gathered in the fellowship hall as usual. Coffee, light conversation, polite laughter. And in the middle of it all, Ethan. He moved easily between groups, shaking hands, exchanging warm greetings. When his eyes landed on me, he paused for just a fraction of a second. Then he smiled. "Mrs. Emerson?" he said as he approached. "It's good to see you again." His voice was smooth, practiced. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. "Good to see you too, Ethan," I replied. Daniel stiffened slightly beside me. Melissa said nothing. Ethan glanced at them briefly. "Your family?" he asked. "My son Daniel," I said, "and his wife, Melissa." He extended his hand to Daniel. "Nice to meet you." Daniel hesitated for just a moment before shaking it. "You too," he said, but his voice lacked warmth. Ethan didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he chose not to. "And Melissa," he added, offering a polite nod. She returned it, her eyes sharp. "We've heard a lot about you," she said. Something flickered across Ethan's face. Quick, almost invisible. "Only good things," I hope he replied with a light chuckle. "Of course," she said. But there was an edge beneath her words. Ethan turned back to me. "I understand you met with Bishop Whitaker recently," he said. My pulse slowed, not faster, slower, because that told me something. He already knew. "Yes," I said calmly. "We were discussing some matters from the past." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "The church has gone through many seasons," he said. "Some more difficult than others." "Yes," I replied, "and some more instructive." Our eyes held for a moment, long enough for something unspoken to pass between us. Recognition, suspicion, maybe both. "Well," he said after a beat, stepping back slightly. "If there's anything I can assist with, please don't hesitate to ask." I smiled faintly. "I'll keep that in mind." He nodded once more, then moved on, blending seamlessly back into the crowd. Melissa let out a quiet breath. "That man is hiding something," she said under her breath. Daniel nodded. "Yeah." I felt it too. I didn't respond, because feeling something and proving it were two very different things. We need more than instinct. I said finally. Then where do we start? Daniel asked. I looked toward the far end of the hall. At the office doors. At the numbers, I said. That afternoon, we stayed behind. Not as obvious investigators, but as volunteers. Daniel offered to help move chairs. Melissa assisted in the kitchen, and I asked to review some old donation records. The request wasn't unusual. After all, I had worked in administration before. No one questioned it, not even Ethan. At least, not openly. The office smelled the same as it always had. Paper, ink, a faint trace of dust. I sat at the desk, flipping through recent financial logs. At first glance, everything looked normal. Balanced, organized, clean. But I knew better. Because I had seen clean before, and I knew how easily it could be manufactured. I began with the simplest approach. Cross-referencing. Dates, amounts, sources. Looking for inconsistencies. Patterns, anything that didn't quite fit. Minutes passed, then an hour. Daniel checked in once, offering a quiet, "You okay?" I nodded. "Keep going," I told him, because I wasn't done yet. And then I saw it. Not a large discrepancy. Not something obvious, just a small entry. A donation listed twice. Same amount, same date, but slightly different account codes. I leaned closer, checked again. Yes, there it was. Subtle, almost invisible, but not to me. I turned the page and found another, and another, each one small, each one easy to overlook. But together they formed something, a pattern. My heart steadied, because this was familiar, too familiar. A quiet knock came at the door. I looked up. Ethan stood there, watching me, burning the midnight oil he asked lightly. I closed the folder slowly. Just catching up on some old habits, I said. He stepped inside. His presence filled the room differently now. Less friendly, more deliberate. "Be careful," he said casually. "Sometimes digging into old records can bring up things that are better left buried." There it was. Not a threat, not directly, but a warning. Clear enough. I met his gaze. Truth has a way of finding its way back, I said. His smile didn't reach his eyes this time. "That it does," he replied. For a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. And in that silence, everything was said. Because now, he knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to realize that the past he thought was buried was standing right in front of him, watching, waiting, and ready to uncover the truth again. There's a moment when suspicion turns into certainty. Not because someone confesses, not because the truth is handed to you, but because the pattern becomes too clear to ignore. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That afternoon, I sat in the church office again. This time, not as a visitor, not even as a volunteer, but as someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Daniel stayed close, pretending to organize files in the cabinet behind me. Melissa worked at the reception desk just outside, her presence quiet but alert. And Ethan was somewhere in the building, watching, waiting, just like we were. I flipped through another set of financial reports, slower this time, more deliberate, because I wasn't just looking for discrepancies anymore. I was looking for intent. And then I found it. A transfer. small, routine on the surface, but routed through an account that didn't match its category. I leaned closer, checked the previous weeks, the same pattern, repeated, adjusted, hidden in plain sight. My heartbeat steadied. Not faster, calmer, because now I knew. This wasn't random. This was controlled, precise, intentional. "Daniel," I said quietly. He stepped closer immediately. "What did you find?" I turned the document toward him. "Look at this." He frowned, scanning the numbers. "I don't look at the account codes," I said. He leaned in further, and then his expression shifted. "Oh," he murmured. "Yes," I said. "That's not right, is it?" he asked. "No." "Look at the account codes," I said. He leaned in further, and then his expression shifted. "Oh," he murmured. "Yes," I said. "That's not right, is it?" he asked. "No," I replied. "And it's not the only one." I showed him the others, each one small, each one carefully adjusted. But together, they told a story. "He's skimming," Daniel said under his breath. "Yes." Melissa appeared at the doorway, her voice low. "Someone's coming." We both looked up. Footsteps, measured, unhurried. And then Ethan stepped into the room. He paused when he saw us standing close together, looking at the documents. His eyes flickered briefly to the papers, then back to me. "Am I interrupting?" he asked. "No," I said calmly. "Not at all." Daniel stepped slightly to the side, but didn't move away. Melissa remained in the doorway, blocking it, subtly. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. His smile returned, but it was thinner now, more controlled. "I see you've taken quite an interest in our records," he said. "I've always had an eye for details," I replied. "That's what I've heard," he said. There it was again, that edge, that quiet acknowledgement that he knew exactly who I was. Not just a woman in the congregation, not just Daniel's mother, but the woman who had once uncovered everything. "You're thorough," he continued. "It's a good quality." "Sometimes," I said. His gaze dropped briefly to the documents on the desk. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. I held his gaze. "Yes." The room went still. Daniel shifted slightly beside me. Melissa's grip tightened on the Melissa's grip tightened on the edge of the doorframe. Ethan's smile didn't disappear, but it changed, barely. "But enough." "I'm glad," he said lightly. "Transparency is important in an Y organization." "Yes," I agreed. "It is." DGE of the doorframe. Ethan's smile didn't disappear, but it changed, barely, but enough. "I'm glad," he said lightly. "Transparency is important in any organization." Yes, I agreed. It is. We stood there, the space between us filled with everything we weren't saying, because now we both knew. Not everything, but enough. Ethan stepped further into the room, closer to the desk, closer to the truth laid out in front of him. "You know," he said casually, "sometimes numbers can be misleading. They don't always tell the full story." I nodded slowly. "That's true," I said, "but they tell enough." His eyes met mine again. Sharp now, focused. "And what do you think they're telling you?" he asked. I didn't answer right away, because this was the moment, the turning point, the place where suspicion either stays quiet or becomes something else. I think I said carefully, "They're telling me that history has a way of repeating itself." Silence. Heavy. Intentional. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "You're referring to the past," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "A difficult time," he said, "but one we've moved beyond. Have we?" I asked. The question hung between us, unanswered, because the truth was already there, on the desk, in the numbers, in the pattern, in the man standing in front of me. Ethan exhaled quietly. Then he smiled again, but this time there was no warmth in it. "Be careful, Mrs. Emerson," he said softly. The room seemed to shrink, just slightly. Sometimes looking for something can make you see things that aren't there. I held his gaze. "And sometimes," I replied, "not looking is what allows things to continue." Another silence, longer this time, deeper. And then he stepped back, slowly, as if measuring the distance between us. "I suppose we'll both see what's really there soon enough," he said. "Yes," I replied. "We will." He nodded once, then turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. For a moment, none of us moved, none of us spoke, because what had just happened wasn't a conversation. It was a line being drawn. Melissa was the first to break the silence. "He knows," she said. "Yes," I replied. Daniel ran a hand over his face. "And we know." "Yes." "So what now?" he asked. I looked down at the documents, at the proof that was almost there, but not quite. "Now," I said, "we make sure he doesn't have time to cover his tracks." Melissa stepped fully into the room. How I looked at both of them. "We don't wait for him to make a mistake," I said. "We force him to." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, "we apply pressure." The word settled heavily, because pressure creates cracks, and cracks reveal what's hidden. Melissa nodded slowly. "You're going to confront him," she said. "No," I replied. "Not directly." "Then what?" I met her eyes. "We bring this to the bishop," I said. "All of it." Daniel hesitated. "And if the bishop hesitates?" he asked. I shook my head. "He won't." "Why are you so sure?" "Because I had seen it before. Because I had lived it. Because I knew what it looked like when the truth reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Because this time," I said quietly, "we're not the only ones who can see it." And as I gathered the documents, sliding them carefully back into the folder, I realized something. 20 years ago, I had uncovered the truth, but I had done it alone, quietly, from the shadows. This time, the truth was stepping into the light, and it wasn't going to be buried again. Pressure changes people. Some crack, some run, and some reveal exactly who they've always been. The next move had to be precise, not emotional, not impulsive. Because Ethan Caldwell wasn't careless. He was patient, calculated, and now aware. That made him dangerous. "We don't have much time," Bishop Whitaker said as we sat around the conference table later that evening. The documents were spread out again. Every discrepancy, every pattern, every piece of truth we had uncovered. Daniel leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "So what's the plan?" he asked. "We bring this to the board," Melissa said, "right now." "No," I said. They both turned to me. "No," Daniel repeated. "If we go to the board with this," I explained, "we give him time. Time for what Melissa asked. To erase everything we haven't found yet, I said. Silence, because they understood. The bishop nodded slowly. She's right, he said. If Ethan realizes we're preparing to expose him, he'll move fast. Daniel exhaled sharply. So, what do we do instead? I looked at the documents, at the patterns that had once led me here before, and then at the gaps, because there were always gaps. We don't stop him, I said. We let him continue. Melissa's eyes widened. You want him to keep stealing? She asked. No, I said. I want him to prove it. The room went still, because now the plan was becoming clear. Daniel frowned. You mean we watch him do it? Yes. And then what? Then we catch him in the act, I said. The bishop leaned back slightly, considering it. That would give us undeniable evidence, he admitted. Melissa shook her head slowly. That's risky. Yes, I said. It is, but it's the only way to make sure this ends completely. Daniel looked at me carefully. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I replied. But this time, we're not hiding in the shadows. That was the difference. 20 years ago, I had protected the truth quietly, alone. This time, the truth would stand in the open, and it would not be ignored. So, how do we set it up? Daniel asked. I took a slow breath. We create an opportunity, I said. For what? For him to make a mistake he can't undo. The bishop nodded slowly. I can arrange a special collection, he said. A larger than usual donation. Something that would pass through his hands directly. Melissa leaned forward. And we track it. Yes, I said. Every step. Daniel's expression tightened. And if he takes it, I met his eyes. Then we make sure he can't deny it. The plan settled into place. Not perfect, not safe, but necessary. That Sunday, everything was set. The church was fuller than usual. Word had spread about a special outreach fund, a donation meant to support struggling families in the community. People gave generously, more than expected. And Ethan was in charge of it all. I watched him from my seat. Not openly, not obviously, but carefully. The same way I had done before. Daniel sat beside me, his posture tense. Melissa kept her gaze forward, but I could see the way her fingers tightened in her lap every time Ethan moved. The collection ended. The baskets were carried forward. And Ethan stepped in, calm, confident, in control. Exactly where he wanted to be. After the service, the counting began. A small group as usual, trusted individuals, Ethan among them. The bishop had arranged for Daniel to assist. Melissa stayed nearby, and I waited, because this part required patience. Time passed slowly, minutes stretching into something longer. Then Daniel appeared at the doorway, his face pale. Mom, he said quietly. I stood immediately. What is it? He looked at the bishop, then back at me. He did it. The room seemed to hold its breath. What did you see? I asked. Daniel swallowed. He separated one of the envelopes, he said, marked it differently. Then when the others weren't looking, he moved it. Melissa stepped closer. Moved it where into a secondary folder, Daniel said. One that wasn't part of the official records. The bishop's expression hardened. Are you certain, he asked? Yes. Daniel didn't hesitate. I watched him do it. Silence. Then, it's time, I said. We moved quickly, not rushed, but deliberate. The office door opened. Ethan looked up as we entered. just for a second. His expression shifted. Not surprise, not fear, but recognition. Because he knew. He knew this moment had come. "Is something wrong?" he asked calmly. The bishop stepped forward. "Yes," he said. "There is." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "I'm not sure I understand." "You will?" I said. His eyes moved to me, and for the first time, there was no pretense, no polite smile, no careful mask, just something colder, something sharper. "You've been watching me," he said. "Yes," I replied. "And you think you've found something. I know we have." A long silence followed. Then Ethan exhaled slowly and leaned forward. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose it was only a matter of time." Daniel stiffened beside me. Melissa's breath caught. The bishop's voice dropped. "Where is it?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer, "Is it?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he smiled, and this time there was no hiding it, no pretending, no denial. "Right where you think it is," he said, and in that moment, the truth didn't need to be uncovered anymore, because it had just stepped forward on its own. Confession doesn't always come with guilt. Sometimes it comes with relief. Ethan Caldwell didn't look afraid. That was the first thing I noticed. As we stood in that small office, documents spread across the desk, truth laid bare between us. He didn't panic. He didn't deny. He didn't even try to run. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting calmly in his lap, as if this moment had been waiting for him just as much as it had been waiting for us. "Well," he said quietly, his voice steady. "I suppose we're past pretending." Daniel stepped forward immediately. "You've been stealing from the church," he said, anger rising in his voice. Ethan's gaze shifted to him. "Stealing," he repeated softly. "That's what you call it? What else would you call it?" Melissa snapped from behind us. Ethan smiled faintly. "I would call it correcting a system that has always taken more than it gives." The room went still, because that wasn't denial. That was justification. Bishop Whitaker's voice hardened. "You were entrusted with those funds," he said. "They were meant to serve the community." "And they do," Ethan replied. The bishop frowned. "How?" Ethan leaned forward slightly now, his eyes sharper. "You think every dollar that passes through this place reaches the people it's meant for?" he asked. "That's the goal," the bishop said firmly. "No," Ethan said. "That's the illusion." Silence, because even the bishop didn't interrupt him. 20 years ago, Ethan continued. Pastor Briggs was made into a villain, a convenient one. My breath caught, because now we were stepping into something deeper. "Are you saying he was innocent?" I asked. Ethan looked at me, and for the first time, there was something like respect in his expression. "I'm saying he wasn't alone," he said. "I know that," I replied. His smile returned slightly. "Of course you do," he said. "You always saw more than you were supposed to." Daniel shifted beside me. "So that justifies what you're doing now?" he demanded. Ethan shook his head. "No," he said calmly. "It explains it." Melissa crossed her arms. "Then explain it," she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. "After Briggs was removed, the church cleaned itself up," he said. "Or at least it tried to." The bishop stiffened. "We implemented new systems, oversight, accountability." "Yes?" Ethan interrupted. "On paper." The tension in the room sharpened. "Do you know how much of the church's funds actually go to the people who need them?" Ethan asked. No one answered. "Because none of us had that number." "Less than you think," he said. "Because systems, even good ones, become inefficient, bloated, controlled by people who care more about structure than impact. Daniel frowned. So, your solution was to take the money yourself, he said. Ethan met his gaze. My solution was to redirect it, to where Melissa asked. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folder. He placed it on the desk. Take a look, he said. The bishop hesitated, then opened it. Inside were receipts, records, names, addresses, not of accounts, but of people, families, medical bills, school fees, emergency housing payments. My heart slowed because I recognized what I was looking at. Not theft. Not exactly, but something else. You've been giving this away? I asked. Ethan nodded. Quietly, he said. Directly, without bureaucracy, without delay. Daniel shook his head. That doesn't make it right, he said. No, Ethan agreed. It doesn't. Melissa frowned. Then why do it? Ethan looked at her. Because I've seen what happens when people wait, he said. Wait for approval. Wait for funding. Wait for systems to move. His voice softened slightly. And sometimes they don't have time to wait. Silence, heavy, complicated. Because this wasn't simple anymore. Not good versus evil. Not right versus wrong. It was something in between. Bishop Whitaker closed the folder slowly. You should have brought this to us, he said. Ethan gave a small, almost tired smile. And risked being told no? He asked. The bishop didn't respond. Because the truth was, he might have. I stepped forward slightly. You learned from Briggs, I said. Ethan nodded. Yes, but you also learned from what happened to him. Yes, and that's why you did it this way, I continued. Smaller amounts, controlled, hidden. Yes. I looked at him carefully. You didn't want to destroy the church, I said. No, he replied. I wanted to fix what it couldn't fix itself. Daniel exhaled sharply. This isn't fixing anything, he said. It's lying. Ethan met his gaze again. Sometimes, he said quietly, the truth isn't what people are ready to hear. I felt something shift inside me, because I had said something similar once, a long time ago. But this was different. You're wrong, I said. Ethan looked at me. Am I? He asked. Yes, I said firmly. Because the truth doesn't need to be hidden to be effective. He studied me for a moment, and yet he said 20 years ago, you hid yours. The words hit harder than anything else he had said. Because they were true. I had hidden it, protected it, kept it in the shadows. But there was a difference. I hid it to expose it, I said. You're hiding it to control it. Silence. Then something changed in his expression. Not anger, not fear, but something closer to realization. The bishop stepped forward. This ends now, he said. Ethan didn't argue, didn't resist. Instead, he nodded. I figured it would, he said. Daniel frowned. That's it, he asked. You're just giving up. Ethan looked at him. I'm not giving up, he said. I'm stepping aside. Melissa shook her head. And what about everything you've done? Ethan glanced at the folder. At least now, he said, you know where to look. And with that, he stood. Not defeated, not broken, but finished. And as he walked past us, out of the room, out of the role he had carefully built for himself, I realized something. This wasn't the same ending as before. 20 years ago, the truth had been hidden to protect the church. This time, the truth was out, and it was going to change everything. Truth doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it rebuilds. The days after Ethan Caldwell stepped down were quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, not yet, but quieter. Because the storm had passed its loudest point, and now we were left with what it had revealed. The church board was called into an emergency meeting that same week. Every document was presented, every record, every discrepancy, and every receipt Ethan had left behind. There was no hiding it anymore. No protecting the truth behind closed doors. This time, everything was laid out in the open. Some were shocked, some were angry, and some were conflicted. Because Ethan hadn't just taken. He had given, but not in a way that could be justified, not in a way that could be trusted. And that was the difference. He crossed a line, one board member said firmly. Yes, Bishop Whitaker agreed, but he also exposed something we need to face. Silence followed, because that part was harder to accept. The system hadn't been broken, but it hadn't been perfect either, and now there was no pretending otherwise. The decision came quickly. Ethan would be removed from all positions. A full financial audit would be conducted, and the church would restructure how funds were handled, making the process more transparent, more direct, and more accountable. It wasn't just a response, it was a correction, a real one, for the first time in years. Daniel sat beside me during the meeting, quieter than I had ever seen him. When it ended, he didn't speak right away. He just walked with me out into the sunlight, his hands in his pockets, his thoughts clearly heavy. I don't know how to feel, he admitted finally, about what I asked. All of it, he said. About him. About you. About what happened before and now. I nodded. That's fair. He looked at me. I thought this was going to be simple, he said. That he was just wrong. And now, I asked. Now I think he was wrong, Daniel said slowly, but not completely. I smiled faintly. That's usually how it is. Melissa joined us a moment later, her expression softer than it had been in days. They're going to use some of his records, she said. For what? To identify families that still need help, she replied. I nodded. Good. She looked at me carefully. You're okay with that? She asked. Yes, I said. Why? Because the good doesn't disappear just because it came from the wrong place, I said. Melissa considered that, then nodded. I guess that makes sense. We stood there for a moment, the three of us, not just connected by family, but by something deeper now. Understanding, growth, change. Later that afternoon, I returned to the sanctuary alone. The light filtered through the stained glass windows, just like it always had. Soft, steady, unchanged. I walked slowly down the aisle, my footsteps echoing gently in the quiet space. And then I stopped. At the front, right where everything had come full circle. The bishop stood there waiting. I had a feeling you'd come back, he said. I smiled slightly. I needed to. He nodded. You did more than uncover the truth, he said. You helped us face it. I shook my head gently. I just refused to ignore it. That's more than most people do, he replied. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he looked at me again. There's something else, he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. What is it? He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, carefully wrapped. He handed it to me. I hesitated for just a second, then unwrapped it. And my breath caught, because there it was, my church hat, restored, cleaned, carefully preserved, just like I remembered it. I found it, he said quietly. In the storage room. Someone must have picked it up after it was thrown away. My fingers trembled slightly as I held it, not because it was just a hat, but because of what it represented. Everything I had lost, everything I had regained, and everything I had learned. Thank you, I whispered. The bishop smiled. No, he said. Thank you. I looked down at the hat again, then back up, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not pain, but peace. That Sunday, I wore it again. As I walked into the church, people noticed. Some smiled, some whispered, but I didn't care, because this time I wasn't wearing it to be seen. I was wearing it because I remembered who I was. Daniel saw me first. He paused for a moment, then smiled. Mom, he said softly, you look strong. I smiled back. I am, I said. Melissa hugged me tightly. I'm glad you didn't stay quiet, she whispered. So am I replied. And as the service began, as the music filled the room, as the light poured through the windows, I realized something. The hat had never been the point. Not really. It was just a symbol of dignity, of identity, of truth. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one choice, one voice, to remind the world and yourself that those things can never truly be taken away. In life, we often think truth is simple, that it lives in clear lines between right and wrong, good and bad, honesty and deception. But the truth is, it's rarely that clean. Sometimes the people who do wrong believe they are doing right. Sometimes good intentions lead to harmful choices. And sometimes silence feels easier than speaking up. But this story reminds us of something deeper. Truth is not just about exposing others. It's about facing ourselves. It's about asking hard questions, even when the answers make us uncomfortable. It's about choosing integrity, not just when it's easy, but when it costs something. Brooke Emerson didn't fight for recognition. She didn't seek revenge. She simply refused to ignore what she knew was wrong. And in doing so, she didn't just uncover a hidden truth. She helped rebuild something broken. Not perfectly, but honestly. And that matters, because real change doesn't come from perfection. It comes from courage, from accountability, from the willingness to do better together. So I want to ask you something. What would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken up? Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to hear your perspective. If this story moved, you don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue sharing stories that matter. And wherever you're watching from, take a moment to tell me your city and the time right now. I love knowing where these stories are reaching, because in the end, we're all part of the same story. just trying to find our way to the truth.